And the people that walk alongside our families are local nonprofits. And when those can't meet the needs, then government steps in to meet the needs. Our nonprofits are teetering on the edge right now. This bill allows the nonprofits to be a part of this whole focus on small businesses being able to get loan and sustain their personnel. It also allows individuals that want to donate to local nonprofits to be able to write that off as an incentive for folks to be more engaged on that. It's a reasonable proposal of how to be able to help. It's a bipartisan solution that Senator Coons and I have, but we can't get to it and vote on it because we're trying to be held up by some bizarre new thing that's thrown in every couple of hours that are unrelated to COVID-19 or the perpetual statement of, it's only $2 trillion, it's not enough. This government's not even set up to be able to distribute $2 trillion. Let's get this out the door. Let's get something started, and let's keep the battle going for the other things. But for the sake of our nonprofits, for the sake of our small businesses, for the sake of people that want to stay employed, the people that are small business and restaurant owners and coffee shop owners and retailers, for the sake of them, why don't we just go ahead and get this vote on and stop delaying it, trying to add one more special interest something into it. I move that we get going and get this done. And I'd encourage my colleagues on the other side to stop trying to renegotiate everything we've already negotiated and to stop adding one more thing. Let's make the one more thing a vote. With that, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator from North Dakota.
Thank you, Mr. President. Earlier I was on the floor and talked about how important it is, along with my fellow colleagues, how important it is that we move this bill and that we get it done now. I mean, it's very important that we get it done now, and we talked about a lot of different things, but one of the points that I wanted to make, because I work with it so much, as do some of my colleagues that are going to join me here, and that's making sure that we're also addressing rural America, our farmers, our ranchers, agriculture, rural America. That's the food supply that everyone depends on every single day, and it's so critically important all the time, but particularly at a time like this when we're faced with a pandemic, that we keep that food supply working and moving the whole food chain, all the way from the farmer and rancher all the way up to the consumer. And as a result of what our farmers and ranchers do, every single American benefits from the lowest cost, highest quality food supply in the history of the world, and they can count on it. They can count on it. So as we pass this Phase 3 bill, which is now, I think, about $1.8 trillion, we cannot leave the farmers and ranchers of America out of the bill. It's that simple. Because every single American depends on them every single day. And not just Americans, but people around the globe. So it's so important that we include agriculture in this bill, and that's what we have worked to do. We have worked to make sure that there is provision in there, so whether it's our cattle producers or whether it's our farmers raising crops across this great nation, that they can continue to do what they do every day on behalf of all Americans. And so I talked about that a little bit earlier, but some of my colleagues want to join in emphasizing how critically important that our farmers and ranchers and rural America is part of this legislation. You know, you see on television the cities every day and what's going on in the cities. In New York or San Francisco or wherever it may be, we get it. There's a lot of people there, and they're close together, and it's a huge challenge. But the food, the sustenance, the food, fuel, and fiber they get every day comes from the heartland, comes from the rural areas. It doesn't just come from the grocery store. It comes from rural America. And we've got to be there for them, keep them going so that they can supply people across this nation and communities, large and small. So I'd like to turn to my good friend from the state of Kansas and ask that, clearly a state known as part of the breadbasket of this nation, and ask that the good senator from Kansas be allowed to make some comments. Mr. President, thank you very much.
Senator from Kansas.
Thank you, Mr. President. I appreciate the leadership of my colleagues, and particularly today, Senator Hoeven, on his efforts. He chairs the subcommittee on appropriations on agriculture and rural development. We're joined here by the senator from Nebraska, Senator Fisher, and the chairman of the Agriculture Committee, my colleague from Kansas, to highlight something that is potentially going to be absent from this legislation. Earlier this month, I asked Secretary Perdue in a letter that I was joined with by many of my colleagues, both Republicans and Democrats, to look for a way to be helpful, particularly to livestock producers, the men and women who raise cattle, who feed cattle, who are the backbone of the ag economy, are certainly a huge and critical component of how we earn a living in Kansas. Both Republicans and Democrats signed the letter asking that Secretary Perdue take steps. The reason this is necessary, at least according to Kansas State University research, since the arrival of Corona, since January, $8 to $9 billion in lost income has occurred for livestock producers in this country. That is a huge and significant amount of money, and one that is hard to recover from. So the chairman of the Appropriations Subcommittee, Senator Hoeven, indicated about the importance of rural America. This is absolutely about feeding not only the rest of our country, but the globe in its entirety. And I would highlight, before I return to this conversation about agriculture, I would highlight how difficult it is in rural America to recover from an economic challenge. Certainly our cattlemen and our livestock producers, our farmers and ranchers recognize we've seen instance in which farmers are going out of business. I would put on top of that, since 2013, on-the-farm income in Kansas is down 50% since 2013. You add this crisis to the challenge, and many of my farmers and ranchers probably will not survive this crisis. So we're asking the Secretary of Agriculture to come to our aid. What we discovered is that the Commodity Credit Corporation, the CCC, needed to be replenished. Money had been spent from the CCC. So we proposed in this bill that is being debated now that the CCC be replenished. $20 billion restored to the Commodity Credit Corporation. We were told by our Democrat colleagues that they wanted to make certain the money couldn't just be spent on the livestock side. And so the provision in this bill, bipartisan agreement, certainly agreement on the side of all of us that we care about farmers as well as ranchers, and so we changed the language to make certain that the Secretary of Agriculture use CCC funds not only for livestock producers, but also for the cultivation, the crop side of agriculture. Incidentally, my colleagues on the Democrat side asked that their names be removed from the letter. I don't understand what happened in a matter of just a day or two in which they decided they were not interested in agriculture producers, livestock producers in particular. And then within the last couple of days, we now learned that the Democrats, I'm not in the room, so I can't verify this, but I'm told by those who presumably know that Democrats are opposed to this provision being included in the bill at all. We cannot forget livestock producers and agriculture as we try to deal with the economic consequences of COVID-19. It is a huge challenge. And so I would ask my Democrat colleagues, those who signed the letters and others who visited with me and my colleagues about trying to solve this problem. I don't know what's going on in the rooms that I'm not a part of, but we need to make certain that an end result is where we started, taking care of those who produce the food and fiber of our nation. While I have the floor, let me point out the challenges of rural America just a couple of steps further and why it is so important to get this done today, now. Community hospitals, significant resources in this bill to try to keep the doors of our hospitals, to keep our physicians practicing medicine, to keep the pharmacy on Main Street are involved in this bill. The number of the dentist. The dentist is a pretty important person in a small town in Kansas. The optometrist, a huge component of how we deliver health care. Very small businesses. Many of them are solo practitioners and they employ just a handful of people. This bill will help them, and yet it is now stymied.
And I would say that even if you're not a healthcare provider, this bill is important to every small business in Kansas. And it's important to the business, not for the business sake, but for the people who work for that business. We want that sole proprietor, but we want that business that employs 10, 5, 50 people. A lot of small manufacturers in Kansas that produce agricultural equipment. They are on the cusp of being put out of business, and what is so dramatic in rural America is if we lose a business, the chances of reviving it in the future disappears. Almost all of our businesses in small towns across Kansas and around the nation are hanging on already by a thread. This is the factor now that may put them out of business, likely to put them out of business, and the chances of them then coming back into business when this is over, virtually none. Our businesses are run by small families, by individuals, by people who often run a business for the sole purpose of making certain their community has a business. We can linger no longer and expect that it will get better if we don't take action to help them preserve their business and the people who work for them, and we do it now, not later. Mr. President, I yield to the senator from Nebraska, to the senator from North Dakota.
Thank you. I'd like to thank the senator from Kansas for his remarks and for his strong work on behalf of not just the livestock industry, and of course, Kansas, obviously, a huge role in the cattle industry, but for all of agriculture. You're always there and deeply appreciative. Before I recognize our next colleague, I do want to make a little change in the order here, Mr. President. If I could, I'd like to recognize our colleague from Michigan, who is the ranking member on the Ag Committee. She had some thoughts that she wanted to interject, and I would be willing to defer to her at this point.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. President.
Senator from Michigan.
I just wanted to share some thoughts, and I appreciate the discussion. Obviously, as you know, Senator Roberts and I have basically co-authored the last two farm bills, and we all care deeply about rural America. I grew up in rural America, and we've got to get things done that are going to help small towns in rural America. The distinguished senator from North Dakota and I have been talking about what we need to be doing in a number of ways. And I just wanted to indicate that when we talk about the needs that have been addressed through the market facilitation payments and so on, that I think we have a joint interest in making sure all of agriculture that has been hurt will be benefited by this. I understand the concerns about livestock. About half the cash receipts of the country are what we broadly call specialty crops. I can tell you, as the #1 producer of tart cherries in the country, maybe the world, we have been hit so very hard by unfair practices with Turkey that we could lose the industry. And yet we've received no help so far from the CCC. And so if we're going to move forward, you know, I have supported and will continue to support doing things we need to do for farmers. But we have to recognize all of the needs, and I'm certainly willing to work with you on that, because that has to happen. And I would finally say this. On the one end, we have our farmers. On the other end, we have all of us who eat. We've got a lot of folks in between that think the food comes from the grocery store. A lot of kids, you know, one of the reasons I support having school gardens is for children to understand that it actually is a lot of hard work and food comes from our farmers. But part of all of this, when we look at this large package, and I know there's a concern about not leaving farmers out, we can't leave people who are at this point struggling to eat out as well. And so having a SNAP increase, we've done in every other crisis we've had a temporary increase in SNAP funds. We desperately need to do that as well. And we know that one of the best economic stimuluses is to provide people with food assistance who immediately have to spend it in the grocery store. And our grocery store owners, large and small, are challenged and going to be challenged. And this all goes right back to the farmer. So I thank you for yielding some time. I just want to say that there are many of us on both sides of the aisle care deeply certainly about agriculture. We had the largest vote, 87 out of 100, Mr. Chairman, of people who voted for the last farm bill. I think almost maybe every Democrat did. We want to make sure we're supporting our farmers. We want to make sure that families are lifted up who are struggling. I'm getting the calls from churches and food banks and everyone who are desperately concerned about families right now. We can't leave our families behind either. So thank you very much.
Mr. President, I'd like to thank the
Dakota.
Yeah, I'd like to thank the Senator from Michigan. No question, she's been a strong advocate for agriculture. Appreciate that. Appreciate the willing to work on this. It is imperative that we include our farmers and ranchers in this legislation, and so I look forward to continuing to work with you. But we do need to get to something that we can approve and include in the package. So thank you, and thank you for your comments. And I would turn to my colleague from Nebraska again. By way of turning to her, the cattle industry has lost between $7 and $9 billion over the last 2 months. The cattle industry, and I know, Mr. President, the cattle industry is important in your state. Over the last 2 months, it's lost between $7 and $9 billion. That's 2 months. And so that's why this is very urgent. We need to act. And I would turn to the senator from Nebraska for her comments.
Mr. President.
Senator from Nebraska.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I'd like to thank my colleague from North Dakota for really being a leader in recognizing the needs that we have across rural America, the needs that we are facing in the heartland for farmers, ranchers, rural communities, rural hospitals. When we're looking at this pandemic and the effects it has all across this country, we need to be cognizant of the fact that we are a very diverse nation. We are a nation of condensed urban areas, and we are a nation with extreme vastness. I happen to live in a county which is in the middle of cattle country here in the United States, where we have less than 1 person per square mile, and there's over 6,000 square miles in my county. We understand what being rural means. We understand the differences that exist, not just within the state of Nebraska, but that exist here in this country. And we believe that that diversity needs to be recognized when we are talking about providing relief to families, relief to small businesses, and recovery. But first we have to get to the relief. We can't get on this bill right now, which what I hear from my constituents, and I know all of you, it doesn't matter if you're a Republican or a Democrat, I know all of you are hearing from your constituents how really ridiculous we look, because we can't get on a bill for political reasons. I hope that as we move forward, we are able to provide relief to families. People are in need, people are hurting, people are scared, and we are here talking, which is a good thing if we come to a positive outcome, but we don't have much time. We have small businesses across this country that are hurting. I've heard from my dentist, I've heard from my neighbors who are very concerned about what's going on and if they're even going to be able to provide for their employees, their families, and have a business to come back to. But when you talk about livestock, I think Nebraskans have a good understanding of that, because livestock is the economic engine in the state of Nebraska. It's the biggest revenue provider in agriculture in the state of Nebraska. It is a part of that ag economy that drives our state's economy. And that's why working on provisions that are going to help producers helps every single person in my state. we reached out in my office to a number of my friends and my neighbors who are family ranchers, family farmers, and asked them, you know, what's going on? The senator from North Dakota talked about the losses, extreme losses that we're looking at. And when I'm talking about farmers and ranchers, I'm talking about family farmers and family